Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and this is a continuation of my Beatles album reviews. Now, hot on the heels after the very successful Rubber Soul in December of '65, the next Beatles album was prepared specifically for the North American market, and that was for the United States and Canada. And that album was Yesterday and Today.
Yesterday, tell me that you've got everything you want. We can work it out if I needed someone.
Released during the Beatles summer tour of 1966, Yesterday and Today, after all these years, is known more for the album artwork than for the actual music on it. Now, it falls in between two major Beatles releases, Rubber Soul December of '65 and Revolver August of '66. Now, both of those albums were rated to build Yesterday and Today along with the Help album. Yesterday and Today was a Capitol compilation, and Capitol got a pretty bad reputation, especially as far as the Beatles were concerned, on how they managed and handled the Beatles' music and how they released them. This is how they built Yesterday and Today. You had 2 songs from Help, 4 songs from Rubber Soul, 3 songs from the forthcoming Revolver album, and 2 songs from the single We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. Here's side 1.
And baby, I love you. Oh, and man, please listen. Your brother, he's a man you must believe. She had to go, I don't know, she wouldn't say. And all I gotta do is act naturally.
And side 2 offered these songs.
You can see me. You come some other day, then it might not have been like this. There's a chance that we might fall apart before too long. Tell me why. What goes on?
Though it only has 11 songs, this is a really strong album, partly because it has 4 hit singles on it. Let's go over those singles briefly. Yesterday hit number 1 in October of 1965. We Can Work It Out hit number 1 in January of '66. The flip side of that single, Day Tripper, hit number 5 in January of '66. Nowhere Man hit number 3 in March of '66. And the single that was released concurrently with the album, which was in June of '66, was Paperback Writer and Rain. Now, Paperback Writer hit number 1 on the 25th of June in 1966. So it was kind of a surprising omission that Paperback Writer or Rain wasn't included on this album. It would have strengthened the album considerably. Now, 2 of the 3 songs poached from Revolver were very fitting. That's And Your Bird Can Sing and Dr. Robert. Those kind of fit in with We Can Work It Out and Yesterday and Day Tripper. I think that's about right. However, I'm Only Sleeping is a different thing entirely, and this was the first song that ever introduced the use of backwards guitars. So that's throughout the song, so this signaled things to come on the next album. Unbeknownst to American audience, this was a sneak preview on the next album, Revolver, and some of these songs, the 3 songs that were on here from Revolver, have different mixes. The mono mixes definitely are different, and the stereo, it's fake stereo, so it's like that dual phonic thing Capitol used to do. So this album is worth it for getting those different mixes as well. If I Needed Someone was George Harrison's lone contribution to this album, and 2 of the weaker songs on here are Act Naturally and its clone, What Goes On. Next to I'm Only Sleeping and We Can Work It Out, those songs seem very dated. So this album is a little bit choppy because of that. All right, let's talk about the cover. This is the most interesting part of this album and the most notable thing. And most of you probably already know that Yesterday and Today came out in 2 different covers. The trunk cover and the butcher cover. Now, the myth is that the Beatles chose the butcher cover, and this was the first choice, and this was released only to be covered up by the trunk cover, which came second. That's actually not true. The trunk cover was the first design, and that was the first intended release. Then the butcher cover, The backlash came over that cover. Then they reverted back to the trunk cover. So let me tell you the story and how this came to be, because it's kind of interesting. Because the Beatles in 1966, if you followed what I said in Rubber Soul, my Rubber Soul review, that was kind of the end of Beatlemania, though maybe not everybody knew it. So 1966 continued with as though Beatlemania was still going on, and there were all kinds of problems throughout the year. This was one of the first. So Brian Epstein, he had actually been invited to work with Capitol on this release. Now, Dave Dexter, who was an executive at Capitol, who had already been demoted by this time. And why? Well, he had botched several Beatles releases, and he just had one bad thing after another that he just didn't handle certain things well, particularly with the Beatles. So the new guy in his place was Bill Miller. Miller was the opposite. He wanted to collaborate with the Beatles, and when he invited Brian Epstein to do so, Epstein took him up on it. So there, in April 29th, because they needed a photo, the Beatles were at Brian Epstein's office for a meeting, and photographer Robert Whittaker was also at his office for a separate meeting. So they just shot some impromptu photos in his office. And this is a picture. This is a French EP. This is Brian's office with those very colorful curtains behind there. And the Beatles are wearing street clothes, so they weren't really dressed for a photo shoot like they normally would be. That's why I think it looks so casual. Now, the photos taken in his office that day were sent to Capitol so they could create a mock-up cover for Brian to proof. Now, earlier in March 25th to be exact, the Butcher photo shoot was done by the same photographer, Whittaker. Now, in this particular shoot, the Beatles and Whittaker, they wanted to get away from the typical Beatlemania style fan pinup type of shots everybody was getting sick of, and the Beatles particularly were getting sick of them. And since Whittaker had a surreal edge to him, he brought a bunch of props along to do this elaborate photo shoot that would be pieced together later for a later photo that was yet to be determined. They took some different photos, group photos together, but also photos with nails driven into his head pretending. You have these false teeth and eyes, broken baby dolls, chunks of meat. And the idea was, and this Whittaker explained years later, this is what he said it was. So the Butcher photo was to appear in the central portion of a triptych. So that's a 3-paneled photograph. This is supposed to look kind of like the religious iconography. And bejeweled silver halos would be added behind the band members' heads. And the remaining space would be designed as a Russian religious icon in colors of silver and gold. The meat is meant to represent the fans, and the false teeth and false eyes is the falseness of representing a godlike image as a golden calf. So all this stuff was going to be layered on to one another. You had this woman holding all these sausages that represented some umbilical cord. I mean, this sounded like the dumbest photo I've ever imagined in my life. So this is what his idea was. How this was going to be assembled later and for what, nobody knows. I doubt it ever would have gotten to that point, but this was what Whittaker said his intentions were. Now, the day the trunk photos were taken, that's these photos that were taken in Brian's office, on that day, the proofs came in from the photo shoot where they had all the Butcher shots taken. And the Beatles, in particular John and Paul, really loved those. Brian hated them. He said he wanted to burn them with his lighter. He hated them so much. So that day, the first Capitol mock-up of the album looked like this. So this is the first trunk cover option. And the reason why that it looks like this is the colors, the blue and the gold here, this orangey gold. This was picked to connect with the release of the Beatles single Yesterday from the previous fall. Those are the colors that were used on that picture sleeve. So somehow they were trying to still connect Yesterday to this, because that's kind of that's the big single on this album to help sell the album. Obviously the title Yesterday and Today, old song and some new songs. So that's why this was chosen as a blue and gold. Now Brian didn't like this, so he vetoed this, sent it back to Capitol, and they gave it another go. Meanwhile, at the same meeting, John and Paul are getting really excited by the photos that they're seeing that Whittaker had taken. particularly the meat and the babies one, the butcher one. When the Paperback Writer video was shot for American audiences, there's a picture of Paul. He holds up some transparencies, and that's the Butcher cover album. So we see him looking at it there. So there was some momentum from John and Paul, who wanted to continue to break out of this Beatlemania, this mop top image. And George and Ringo they didn't have much to say about it. I don't think they were that excited about it. The photo shoot with Whitaker had gone well, but they were just kind of having fun, not knowing what would become of all that. So even though Brian hated that photo, he deferred to John and Paul. And by May 23rd, Capitol were sent the Butcher cover transparencies for the album cover. Now, Capitol's art department was really for this Butcher cover album. They loved it. So I guess the artists kind of saw the vision or saw the artistic value of the shot. Well, management didn't like it at Capitol. Now, I don't know if Brian was thinking that management at Capitol might halt it. I don't know. But what happened was Alan Livingston of Capitol did not like it. And what got caught up in a problem, again, Capitol had issues getting albums delivered to the stores on time of Beatle product. This had been a problem for quite a while. So Livingston wanted to do a test. Let's just send out some to some shops and see how it goes and see if we get any reaction. Well, that didn't happen. They did the full 750,000 run of this album with the Butcher cover. And again, they did this because they were under orders to deliver the album on time. And this stuff was happening very quickly, and somehow Livingston's test didn't get followed. So 750,000 of these went out. Now there was immediate backlash, and the backlash was from radio DJs, it was from fans, it was from critics. Just about everybody had a problem with it. Now, many of these did get out. They were supposed to return them all immediately. And I don't know, nobody knows how many were sold in the shops. Some people say very little, but DJs got them and people kept them. They were supposed to return them all. Obviously, a lot of people didn't return them. I'm sure some stores sold them as they were. So these got out. That number is not quite known. Could be as many as 60,000, 20,000, nobody really knows. So Livingston's instincts were correct. This album cover did create controversy. So it was a very big expense, a $250,000 expense to bring these back and paste over what was going to be the redo of the trunk cover, which is this one. Now, there was talk about trashing everything, but they just did the paste over. They saved some money doing that. This is the only Capitol album, or the only Beatles album, that actually lost money upon release because of this fiasco. The reprint of the album was not just a new slick for the album cover, but also all the promotional items as well. So the $250,000 cost, in 60 years later, here we are on the anniversary of this album, 60 years later, that would be about $2.5 million in 2026. So that wiped out the initial profit. So what I always do when I look at these old do these Beatle reviews is I look at actual reviews in the day. And what's interesting is that most people, the reviews I could find, they just are talking about the album cover. They're not talking about the music at all. KRLA Beat berated the Beatles for supplying, quote, the most nauseating album cover ever seen in the U.S., saying that the image amused no one and appeared to be designed for shock value. The reviewer added that the band seemed ignorant of their audience's tastes and concluded that no one can kill the Beatles except themselves, and perhaps they're doing that now. So we see this backlash here, and this is the first time I've seen where somebody mentions that the Beatles do not understand their audience's tastes. And we start to see this in the coming years as well. And the audience is also changing. So with Rubber Soul and perhaps, Revolver, this is when we don't see the screaming girls really following the Beatles. It's the young guys. That's really the switchover. So there was a UK response as well. Now, this album did not come out in the UK. However, this photo, the Butcher cover photo, was used for promotional purposes to promote the Paperback Writer single. and it met similar backlash. So there was a couple different things used, and it was first used in a full-page ad in black and white on June 3rd in the issue of NME. A different photo from the shoot appeared in full color on the cover of the June 11th edition of Disc and Music Echo, lacking the doll parts but retaining the raw meat. So it had this corny headline, Beatles, what a carve-up. Pure corn, right off the cob. The picture attracted an unfavorable response from many of the magazine's readers, and the UK music press were also offended by the ads. So here's what Whitaker said in the British music mag, Disc and Music Echo. He was interviewed. Quote, I wanted to do a real experiment. People will jump to the wrong conclusions about it being sick, but the whole thing is based on simplicity, linking four very real people with something real. I got George to knock some nails into John's head and took some sausages along to get some other pictures, dressed them in white smocks as butchers, and this is the result. The use of the camera as a means of creating situations. A bunch of nothingness is what that is. So Whitaker was later quoted as saying that the basic motivation for making what was called a somnambulant adventure came from the fact that he and the Beatles were really fed up with taking what once would hope be a designer-friendly publicity pictures. So Lennon confirmed this in one of his last interviews where, they were kind of tired of that, very pop style of photography. So what's interesting is that the backlash in the UK happened like 12 days before it was released in the US, and yet nothing was done about it. So I don't know what Epstein was thinking. Or he was just tone deaf, or they were just going to go with it, apparently. So they could have probably saved themselves a bit of a hassle had they paid attention to what was going on in the UK. What? Okay, hold on. Bogey's got to go out. I'll be right back. Now in America, the backlash of the Butcher cover was first seen in print in a Billboard magazine on June 25th. So the cover controversy marked the first time that the Beatles' judgment was criticized by the media and distributors. Now this is going to be something that becomes common with the Beatles, where they're outgrowing their fans, and they're not really making music for their fans as much as they're making music for themselves. And this is why some of their music going forward is some of the greatest music they made. But they do run into some problems like this, where fans don't always take to it. So that's the story of the fabled Butcher cover. And this album, as I said, doesn't get talked about a whole lot other than the cover. But one of the things that Capitol, I thought, did that was a good thing with their compilations is they added the singles onto the albums. And why Paperback Writer or Rain didn't make it onto this album is a mystery to me, because they knew in America that singles on albums helped sell albums. Nowhere in the world did they sell more albums than in the United States. And I think that's proof of that, because you had guys who maybe weren't buying singles. The kids bought singles because it was cheaper. More adults were buying albums, so having those singles on the albums I think really helped. And I think that one other song that they could have put on here was the song I'm Down. That was a song that was kind of hanging out there that hadn't made it onto an album. I think that would have fit on here better than, say, Act Naturally. And besides, I'm Down was used as the show closer on many of their concerts in 1966. In fact, 4 of the songs from this album were performed on tour in 1966. So at least some of the songs that they were playing live were still on a current album. That was something that was going to happen with the next album. Everything the Beatles did sold well, and this album was no exception. It was #1 for 5 weeks and sold almost 1 million copies by the end of the year, despite this controversy of the cover. Now, this album is kind of close to me because it's the very first album that I bought brand new, and that's this one right here. I bought this in about, I would say, 83, right in there, and this is the Purple Capitol. And the first album I owned was Introducing the Beatles. That was my mother's. The second album by the Beatles I owned was Abbey Road. That was a gift from my buddy. And the third one I owned was this one, which I bought. So I had the first album, the last album, one right in the middle. So this one has always been kind of a special album to me. And the Butcher cover, even as a young teen, when I learned about the butcher cover. I just found the whole thing very interesting. I wasn't put off by the imagery in it as much as some people might have been. I always appreciated the collectability and the story behind the album. All right, you might be wondering, what is this I have here? Is this an original? No, this is a reprint. These have been selling steadily for 15 years, and this one came in green for some strange reason. I wish I had a black one. But anyway, these sell for, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 bucks now. And these are just nice to have in the collection. I do have an original butcher cover, and I do talk about that in another video. I'll leave a link to that. And I did an album that never was, featuring a potential re-release of this album with a gatefold and a drastically different track listing. So I'll leave that video at the end of this as well. You can check that out. I hope you enjoyed this Beatles album review. As you may have guessed, I am doing these in order so you kind of can figure out the next one that'll be coming. Meanwhile, I'll be talking with a writer that knows quite a lot about this whole album and the whole fiasco behind it, and there'll be a book coming out late in the year. So I will have that person on and interview them, and we'll go deeper into this. So appreciate you watching. As you know, I've got a website with a lot of my merchandise on it, a tip jar below. All you got to do is click on that link if you want to do a one-time donation. And I've got a Patreon sponsorship as well for those who want to help out this channel in a bigger way. So I appreciate everybody's help and the donations, and I also appreciate when you subscribe. See you next time on Pop Goes the 60s.